Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our online version of AHVS 295B. Today, what I wanted to do is just sort of wrap everything up by going over everything that we've looked at so far this semester. As you can probably hear, the wheels have kind of come off the trolley here at the Perry Mansions, and it looks like armed insurrection is happening all around us. So I'm not sure how useful this bunker is going to prove to be. Excuse me. In the end, at least we've got the videos, the DVDs that we can watch, and as long as we have hydro and are able to keep the roving gangs of feral children attacking the compound at bay, then we should be fine for the rest of this lecture at least. So fingers crossed, right? So what I wanted to do today then is just go over a review for the things that we've covered. And I wanted to do this because today's film, The Shape of Water, is going to be the film we're going to ask you to write about next week. So what we'd like to do for the for the scheduled in-class quiz the next week, next Tuesday, instead of doing that, we're going to ask you to write a short response to a question about today's film, The Shape of Water. So the idea is that you will we will post the question next Tuesday, the 31st, around the same time as class time. And we ask that you email your response to your TA. So don't send it to me, send it to your TA by 5 o'clock the next day. So by 5 o'clock on Wednesday, April 1st. And the question will be very simple, but the idea is that what we'd like to do, and the idea in general was that The Shape of Water was going to be a film that would in some ways sum up many of the things that we'd focused on this semester. So my hope was that by doing this assignment, we'll, in a sense, be covering the same kind of range of things that we would cover if we had done the in-class quiz. Okay, so I hope you're all safe. I hope you're all keeping away from the gunfire and so on. What I wanted to do first off then is just to go over these various things that we've looked at over the course of the semester. So to begin, we looked at the idea of genre, one of the early ways that film scholars have focused on coming to terms with cinema, finding ways of discussing it and discussing it in a meaningful sense. So beginning with genre, you'll remember that we talked primarily about those conventions, the idea that genres are this sort of tacit agreement between spectators and filmmakers, and that one of the ways in which that tacit agreement is upheld is in the form of conventions. So the one thing that we'd emphasize perhaps is to be aware of the different types of conventions, like, for example, the stylistic or technical conventions, plot conventions, and so on. Be aware as well of the various stages that genres go through in the course of their evolution. Over time, genres develop new attributes, they develop new conventions, they reject old ones that are no longer working, and so on. So if we keep in mind this idea of the genre as an idea, as a kind of agreement between the various participants in the screening of a film or the watching of a film, I think we can get a sense of how audiences and filmmakers alike have contributed to the evolution of the various genres. So keep in mind those stages in the evolution of genre. In particular, perhaps in the case of today's film, the kind of revision of the genre, or the kind of Baroque or excessive style of the film, sort of hearkening back to the Baroque phase of genre. We also, remember, talked about documentary as our key genre for the section on genre. So we went over the various conventions that we associate with documentary. Today's film, obviously not a documentary, but still, the documentary itself kind of functions as a test case, so to speak, that we can then look at in order to get perhaps a better sense of how genre functions. Last point related to genre that we talked about was the idea of these narratives of conflict and narratives of integration. Narratives of conflict usually associated with genres like the detective film, the war film, the horror film, the crime film, things like that. Excuse me, in which everything is solved by conflict. Everything is solved by some kind of physical, violent action. And the sort of triumph of one side over the other, whether that's one army defeating another, or the detective defeating the criminal, or the monster being defeated by the humans, or what have you. So narratives of conflict take that form. Narratives of integration would be, as we said, associated with things like comedy, the romantic comedy, genres like that, musicals, these genres that emphasize the integration of characters, the bringing together of characters, and the kind of working through of problems rather than the use of violence to solve those problems. Now, after talking about genre, because we had looked at Werner Herzog, we had the opportunity to extend that a little bit and focus on the idea of the auteur theory. That idea that the director of a film is its author. So you'll remember when we looked at auteurism, which again is another early way of focusing on studying cinema in a meaningful way. The first thing that I'd ask us to keep in mind is the essay by François Truffaut, in which he talks about the politique des auteurs, the policy of authors, and sort of outlines the central idea, the central criteria for the auteur theory. So be familiar with those criteria and that central idea, because by the time it reaches America, the auteur theory, Andrew Sarris and his work on Hollywood reshapes that. And you'll remember that he has those three circles that he outlines as being sort of key components of what makes an auteur in Hollywood. Now, along with what Sarris says in response to this idea of the auteur put forward by Truffaut, we also have a number of critics who've pointed out problems that are inherent in the auteur theory. The most significant of those, perhaps Pauline Kael. But it would be a good idea, I think, to be familiar with those problems, those objections that critics have expressed to the auteur theory. In particular, related to this idea of canonicity and the general idea of the canon, one of the arguments that we could certainly make about the auteur theory is the extent to which it excludes those who do not fit into the dominant role in society, or who are not connected to Hollywood's dominant model, by which I mean, of course, the white, straight, male director. So directors of color are excluded from the auteur theory, women are excluded from the auteur theory, and I think these are partly inherent in the idea of a canon itself, that sort of discrimination, in the sense of being discriminating, being kind of built into the idea of the canon. We also talked specifically about Alfred Hitchcock and the various things that one can associate with Hitchcock's films as a sample case for the auteur theory, and as a way of sort of introducing some of the concerns that Hitchcock pursues, but also, I think, concerns that kind of point to those problems that we identified. Now, after looking at the auteur theory, we moved on and looked at alternatives to the Hollywood model, and at least in the form of national cinemas. And this is where that key term is introduced, the term that runs throughout the semester, but really it first shows up when we talk about national cinemas and the idea of hegemony, that consensus culture that Antonio Gramsci talks about. So in Gramsci's argument, we are not forced to support the dominant values. We're not forced to prop up the so-called 1%. Gramsci didn't say that, but I am. We're not forced to do this. Instead, Gramsci argues that we are convinced to do this. We agree to do this. We are granted certain certain things that allow us to feel good about the fact that we're supporting a system that is in place to, if not oppress, at the very least suppress the vast majority of people in the society. And we also talked, while mentioning this, we talked about the idea of a sort of stylistic hegemony, the way in which the Hollywood model of filmmaking has become the dominant model throughout the world in terms of mainstream cinema. And I think it's worth pointing out the sense that we believe that Hollywood films, or at least the model of films, of filmmaking that Hollywood has put forward, is the natural way of making a film. That films should follow that model because in some way it's natural, it's common sense. And I would argue that this is one way in which hegemony functions, that it convinces us that what we are seeing is natural, that it's the most logical choice, that it's always been this way, and so on. You might want to take a peek at the chart that I posted about the various modes of production, particularly in relation to government produced films. But really, that's not going to help you very much when it comes to this final assignment. We also talked, because we were focusing on Canadian cinema, we also talked about those traits, those attributes that are seen as being common to English Canadian film. And I hope what became clear was in part the ways in which that kind of approach to national cinemas can be both rewarding and limiting. It allows us to look for certain characteristics that we might identify as being inherently Canadian in cinema. But we can also be reminded of the fact that this is a reliance upon a certain set of stereotypes about Canada, and again, that it's kind of reflexive of the values of the critics, perhaps, and the dominant groups, rather than being representative of the vast variety and diversity of films being produced in Canada, especially in recent years. And this led to a consideration of Mina Shum and Double Happiness, and this idea of the diasporic cinema, the cinema produced by first, second, third generation immigrants to various countries around the world, and their engagement with and involvement in the production of film, and how that idea of immigrant filmmakers challenges the central idea behind national cinemas, this sense that there's a specific, unique characteristic to cinemas produced by any nation. We talked briefly about the cinema of Quebec, but again, really mainly within the context of this sort of counter to the Hollywood model. We also talked about First Nations cinema with Rhymes for Young Ghouls, but in particular, we focused on that film as part of this broader question of colonialism and what it means to talk about a nation. Can we identify Canadian cinema, for example, as coming from a specific nation when we know that it's a nation, the nation of Canada, has been built upon territory that doesn't belong to it, that doesn't belong to European settlers, but instead belongs to the First Nations who've been colonized by those European settlers. So the ideas of colonialism, I think, play an important role in the latter half of the semester, And I think in some ways we might be able to find ways of connecting the idea of colonialism to a film like The Shape of Water, which presents us with characters who are in the sort of subaltern position in relation to the government agents who are clearly in the dominant position. I think it's also worth considering the extent to which colonialism in film and in terms of the study of cinema, um, the emphasis that we are now placing on or recognizing um, on resistance to colonialism and resistance to the being cast into the subaltern position. And so, one thing that I think might be worth considering when you're looking at The Shape of Water is this idea of resistance to the dominant, resistance to the powers that be and the authority figures. Naturally, I think, because we've been looking at hegemony and because we've been looking at national cinemas as an alternative to Hollywood, and because we've been talking about colonialism and that sense of resistance, that led into a consideration of this general idea of alterity or otherness. You remember we briefly touched on Jacques Derrida and his notion of the critique of the sign, the formula for the sign as it was drawn up by Saussure. And what Derrida emphasizes is that formula, the sign, arises from the interaction between the signified, meaning the object that is being described, and the signifier, meaning the word that one uses to describe the signified, that creates what he calls binary oppositions, these binary pairs that are ostensibly distinct and separated from each other, but as he points out, carry the trace of each other. And because of that notion of the trace, we began to consider this idea of the relationship between the self and the other. So, looking at The Visitor, for example, we find that the character Walter, who is clearly the one whom we would initially, at least, identify with, as over the course of the film, we begin to see him as he is seeing himself through the eyes of these other characters, these characters who have been othered. And suddenly he finds himself positioned as a kind of other as well. But it's the interaction between him, between Walter and Zainab and the others that he comes to recognize not just his own sense of identity, but the identity of his nation, of America, of the dominant order in the United States in the post 9/11 years. Now, because we talked about alterity and we talked about this idea of binary oppositions, one of the most noticeable, most obvious binary oppositions in terms of conventional thought has long been the idea of the division between male and female, this sense of gender being a crucial aspect of human interaction. And this has been an important part of film studies as well. So we moved from talking about alterity in general to more specific examples of otherness, beginning with an examination of feminism in film, the role that gender plays, and specifically talking about that in relation to identification. And when I say identification, in part, I'm talking about the sense of one's own identity. I identify as such and such. But also in the sense of how cinema manages to make us identify with characters and the ways in which the representation of those characters can be tied to our own experience of watching film. So we began by looking at Laura Mulvey and her notion of the gaze, specifically the male gaze. Mulvey, you'll remember, talks about the three gazes of cinema. There's the gaze of the characters, the gaze of the camera, and the gaze of the spectator. And what she points out is that possession of the gaze satisfies this sort of scopophilic thing, as she identifies it, this voyeuristic desire. But whoever possesses the gaze possesses power in the film. That the ability to look forms a kind of power for the looker. And invariably, Mulvey argues, the person imbued with the power of the gaze, specifically in Hollywood films, but I think in most mainstream narrative films, it's a male character, it's the male spectator, it's the male camera that kind of functions and possesses the power of the gaze. That leads into some other stuff, which I'll talk about in a second. But in order to discuss the idea of identification, we began by looking at the idea of censorship imposed by the Hays Code because of the impact that censorship had on the development of film stars, and in particular, the ways in which stars were presented to their public, what kind of model they presented to the public for a decent person or for a quote unquote normal member of society and so on. So we talked about the star and the three components that are linked to the star, the idea of the real person, the person in the real world, the quote unquote real person, the person in the films that they've played in, the roles that they've taken on, and then the star persona, which is kind of a combination of the first two, but is ultimately the vision of the star that is being sold to us by the studio who is responsible for making that star's films. And it's that kind of constructed sense of the star. Now, the star and the star's connection to the audience becomes a really important part of this notion of suture. Suture, you'll remember, is the methods by which films are able to stitch, so to speak, the audience into the narrative, the ways in which we're encouraged to identify with certain characters and see the world that we're looking at in the film as being a real world. Now, that initially, I think, ties back to Jacques Lacan's idea of the mirror stage, that point in the child's development when they look at themselves in the mirror, they see their reflection, and they mistake the image for themselves. And what a lot of film scholars have suggested is that when we go to the movies and we're looking at a film and we see the hero or the heroine or whoever we're looking at, we find ourselves identifying with those characters. We find ourselves mistaking those characters for ourselves in a way. And connected to all of this as well, we talked about Judith Butler and the ideas of queer theory, that sense of performative language and performative gender, the calling into being of gender, the calling into being of identity. Now, after talking about feminism and gender, we moved on to talk about another of those categories that are usually linked to this idea of alterity, and that's the idea of race and how race is represented in film. Our emphasis fell on the portrayal of African Americans in Hollywood cinema, but as I tried to suggest, this wasn't limited to depictions of African Americans. This sort of othering of racialized people becomes a key component of filmmaking in the United States during the studio era. But I would also suggest it is something that is employed by film industries around the world in different ways and to different degrees. Anyway, when talking about race and representation, we began by looking at people like Oscar Micheaux and his sort of counter cinema that presented itself in opposition to the mainstream by focusing on issues that faced Black characters, problems that they ran into in the African American community, issues of racism, which were not being addressed in the mainstream cinema at all, but were just being capitalized on, and so on. So Michaud and those early independent filmmakers played an important role in laying the ground for subsequent films by people of color. One of the first manifestations of that, of course, was blaxploitation films, those films that presented in many ways sort of stereotypical visions of African American life, but that still appealed to African American audiences because they were geared to those audiences and because they were often made by those filmmakers from those communities. We talked about the various tropes that are used by filmmakers as a sort of shorthand for race, a way of, in a sense, presenting characters of color, but presenting them through a white lens rather than presenting those characters through the lens of their own ethnicities, their own races, rather. And we also talked as well about the idea of whitewashing, of that casting of white actors in roles that should be going to actors of color, or the reshaping of characters of color so that they become white characters instead. So that was where we basically left off last week when we introduced Get Out. So what I'd like to do now briefly is just introduce today's film, The Shape of Water, which I know many of you have already seen, but I do want to encourage you to watch it again if you haven't watched it recently, or even if you have, because I think it's good to look at a film and kind of revisit a film based on the kind of things that we've been doing in here. Our goal is not simply to get you to watch films for 3 months every Tuesday, but also to encourage you to apply the things that you find in this class to the films that you might watch at home. So, Guillermo del Toro, a very interesting filmmaker, born in Guadalajara, in Jalisco, in Mexico, born in 1964. Very early age, he started making his own short films on Super 8 film. He started working in special effects and did that for about a decade, special effects and special effects makeup. And eventually, while making all these short films, he decided to move into the production of feature films. His first feature film was Kronos, a horror film that's largely about the fear of aging and the desire for immortality and the extent to which people are willing to strive for that. Very interesting film, kind of creepy grub-like things in it. His first film made for United States studio, made for the U.S. Audiences and with a U.S. producer, the film Mimic, which starred Mira Sorvino. That film was not particularly successful when it came out, but I think it's gained a degree of notoriety now, if only because it was a Harvey Weinstein produced film, and Weinstein played a very large role in making the experience of shooting Mimic a really unpleasant experience for Del Toro. Followed that with several others, and as I should point out, this is a very minimal version of a filmography for Del Toro. Pan's Labyrinth in 2006, in which he marries the idea of imagination and horror and links those things to the struggle against fascism in Spain during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. Interestingly, Del Toro is adamant that the horror film is inherently a political genre, that it's a genre that can't escape being political, and to some extent I'll talk about that in a second. But I think Pan's Labyrinth is the film that really emphasizes that. He also made several other films, of course, before making The Shape of Water in 2017. probably his most successful film, both in terms of box office and in terms of awards and celebrity from critics. The Shape of Water won Best Picture, Best Director, Best Production Design, Best Original Score at the Oscars, and was I think Del Toro's most popular, most successful film. He works in a lot of different genres, relatively a lot. I mean, his genre interests are somewhat narrow, but he has worked in several genres. But it seems as though the horror film is the constant influence, the one that he frequently returns to throughout his career, and it's had a huge impact on him. And I think that's mainly because he's really drawn to the idea of the monster. You remember when we talked about otherness and alterity, one of the things that I pointed out is that there's often a link between the other and the monstrous. And I also pointed out that the word monster is connected to the Latin word for to show, right? To demonstrate, to demonstrate. So that idea of the monster as spectacle, as that which is to be looked at, but also the monster as other, as this radically different, radically other figure with whom we can't identify, and yet we're unable to tear our eyes away. And I think for Del Toro, part of what he enjoys doing is presenting us with these monsters who kind of challenge the idea of monstrosity and challenge the idea that the monster is the other, that the monster is the outsider, or at the very least, films that present us with monsters who remind us of the injustice of casting monsters as other or casting the other as monster. So he's particularly drawn to monsters that are found in films, horror films from Universal Studios in the early part of the 1930s. Bela Lugosi's version of Dracula, for example, or Boris Karloff's version of Frankenstein's monster, Lon Chaney's version of the Wolfman, and later, and I think most relevant to today's film, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, I think is a really big influence on the look of the amphibious man that we see in The Shape of Water. So what I'd ask you to focus on while you're looking at today's film, while you're watching today's film, first off, this notion of the monster as other, and how that's used by Del Toro to present us with a number of different characters who are othered by the mainstream, as represented by Michael Shannon's government agent, Strickland. So I'd ask you to think about how the monster is portrayed and how many monsters, in quotes, the film presents us with. Both monsters in the sense of those who have been othered, and monsters in the different sense of those who behave monstrously. And I'm thinking here of Strickland. The other thing that I'd ask you to think about, though, would be to connect this back to the idea of genre itself. So while this film definitely borrows from the horror genre, I would argue that it's also bringing in different genres, and it's kind of blending those other genres with the horror genre. It's almost as though we're given the chance to watch a romance or a love story as it would have been told by a monster of some kind. Doesn't that sound good, right? Well, those are the things I'd ask you to think about. We will have tutorials this week on Friday in the fora on Course Spaces. These will be our last tutorials. So one other thing that I'd ask you to think about for the tutorials is just sort of if you've experienced over the course of the semester any changes in your attitude towards films, if your choice of favorite film has changed over the course of the term. And if it hasn't, that's obviously fine. Um, and yeah, if you had any films that struck you as being particularly interesting on the course, or films that you enjoyed um, on the course. So that's what we'll be looking at this week. Next week, there will be that assignment. So I'll be posting the question on Course Spaces on Tuesday. And watch out for that announcement. And again, the assignment will be due by 5 o'clock on Wednesday, April 1st. All right. It's only very short. It's about what we'd like is a page and a half, 2 pages, double spaced, 12-point font. And yeah, we'll give you guidelines for that on the day. All right. But it won't be anything too exhaustive. Okay. Couple of last points I wanted to make. One, as soon as you finish watching this video lecture, I think it'd be a really good idea for you to contact your TA by email and just thank them for the terrific work that they've done this semester, especially towards the end here when we've had so much stuff to deal with. But I'm really pleased with the work that the TAs have done this semester, and I hope that you are too, and that you'll take the opportunity to thank them for that. The other thing, though, is that I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you, because I've really enjoyed working with you this semester. It's been a real pleasure, and it's unfortunate that the semester ends this way, but I am glad that we've at least been able to have these video lectures that we can at least have a pseudo face-to-face connection. But anyway, it's been a pleasure working with you, and I hope that I will see you in future film classes, should the apocalypse not end up happening this year. So in the meantime, please take care of yourselves, look after yourselves, and wash your hands, and be good. And yeah, thanks for a great semester. Take care. Bye-bye.